army drove across the French frontier into Belgium, and 1 day later liberated its capital, Brussels. Now, the British were just 100 miles from the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, and the Americans were just 70 miles from the River Rhine. Although the Allied advance since D-Day had been spectacular, it had caused serious supply problems. Every ton of fuel and ammunition had to travel hundreds of miles from the original landing sites, and Cherbourg, the only port as yet operational, was right back in Normandy. Even worse, despite the rapid retreat of the Germans, resistance was clearly growing. As the battle raged closer and closer to the Reich's frontier, the defenders would become ever more determined. Franklin Roosevelt had been President of the United States since 1932. He was one of the most popular presidents in American history, and in late 1944 faced an unprecedented fourth election. But to his friends and colleagues, it was clear that the 62-year-old Roosevelt had aged severely under the strain of office. He was in fact dying, and it took all his strength to concentrate on winning the war quickly and with as few more casualties as possible. With little thought beyond victory, Roosevelt was frustrated by the endless political machinations of both Stalin and Churchill. Nevertheless, one major post-war issue had to be decided. Where would the approaching Russian and Western armies stop? And when hostilities ceased, who would occupy which parts of Germany? At the summits of 1944 and 1945, it would be decided that Berlin, the capital of the Reich, was to be taken by the Russians. The goal of the Western Allies would be to capture Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr, lying behind the River Rhine. Tired and ill, Roosevelt would play only a minor role in the Allied negotiations, and many American leaders believed that the British and Russians were already taking advantage of his exhaustion. Roosevelt was under added pressure from his military commanders, who believed that the British held more power in the Allied command structure than the size of their armed forces justified. A rift was growing between the British and Americans that now seriously threatened the very existence of the Western Alliance. In the midst of increasing acrimony, Roosevelt tried his utmost to bolster the alliance by careful diplomacy. The president remained convinced that the preservation of the special relationship between Britain and America was the only way to ensure the fastest possible defeat of the Third Reich. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister of Britain since May 1940 and had led the country when all her allies in Europe had been defeated by the Germans. He had gone on to lead Britain through a massive German bombing campaign and a threatened invasion. Churchill had steadfastly refused to surrender or negotiate with Germany and had launched aggressive campaigns in North Africa and the Balkans before the American entry into the war in 1941. Once the United States had declared war on Germany and had lent its vast industrial and military resources to the defeat of Hitler, Britain's influence on the conduct of the war was inevitably threatened. For more than 2 years, Churchill and his military commanders fought a highly successful campaign to preserve British influence in Allied councils. However, by 1944, there were simply too many differences. One of the most significant was over the alliance with Communist Russia. Winston Churchill was, and always had been, deeply suspicious of Stalin's Soviet Union. Already the advancing Red Army had liberated countries not formally under communist control, and Churchill believed that Stalin had sinister plans for these nations after the war. He was deeply frustrated by the lack of American support in attempting to limit Soviet ambitions, but Roosevelt would not be swayed by any considerations that could affect how soon the war was won. Churchill understood that there were strong anti-British pressures on Roosevelt, and although determined to limit Russian post-war influence in Europe, he could not press his case too hard with the Americans. There was another equally important constraint on Churchill. Great Britain faced bankruptcy and desperately needed to end the war. As a result, Churchill was reluctantly forced to acknowledge that post-war interests would have to be set aside, and that it would be the Americans who determined how the Allies would fight the last battle in Western Europe. Despite the military setbacks of 1944 on both the Eastern and Western fronts, Adolf Hitler still hoped that he could snatch a last-minute victory. The doubts of military commanders were furiously dismissed as defeatist and traitorous, and Hitler increasingly chose loyalty and fanaticism over military competence. Hitler believed that the alliance formed against Germany was fundamentally an unnatural one, and was sure that the pact between Communist Russia and the capitalist West could not possibly last. Hitler also knew of the growing tensions between Britain and America, and did everything in his power to drive a wedge between the Allies. The Führer believed that to destroy the Western alliance, the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe had to inflict such terrible casualties on the Americans in particular that they would become too demoralized to fight on. The British would be unable to win victory alone and would be forced to come to terms. With the war in the West over, Hitler could then transfer all his forces to the Eastern Front and defeat the Red Army. To this end, Hitler ordered his Wehrmacht to hold firm at all costs. They were never to give ground, and they were never to surrender. The Allied strategy for the final invasion of Germany had been drawn up before the Normandy landings had begun. Senior army commanders, hoping to win the war with as few more casualties as possible, believed that Berlin had no military benefits which could justify an extra 200-mile advance. In any case, the Allied hope was that the occupation or complete destruction of the industrial Ruhr would by itself prevent the Germans from fighting on, and so end the war before the year was out. On the way to the Ruhr, the Allies would be faced by a series of rivers and canals, formidable natural obstacles. By far the greatest was the River Rhine, symbolic frontier of the German homeland. Many Allied commanders hoped that the mere act of crossing the Reich's last barrier would result in a complete breakdown in German morale. Resistance, they believed, would crumble away, and a quick victory would be achieved. Allied spearheads had already proved themselves capable of advancing more than 75 miles a day, and by early September 1944, the Rhine lay just 70 miles